Okay, so my area of research has predominantly been in the economic partnership agreements between the EU and the African, Caribbean, Pacific. And I am from a legal background, but I'm very interested in the interconnections between law, politics, political economy and economics. So my work at the moment is drawing on different theoretical frames to inform the legal framework and to also look at how the legal framework is perpetuating certain ideology within the WTO system, and in particular in relation to regional trade agreements. The WTO was obviously founded in 1995 as the successor to the GATT, which was established on the principles of equality and non-discrimination between trade partners through its principles of MFN and non-discrimination. What I'm interested in is sort of deconstructing the WTO's and the EU's approach to development to show why this discourse is quite problematic at the moment in terms of progress, and in doing so looking at development as a more holistic concept. So moving away from the more neoclassical versions of development as being measured in economic growth to one more sort of in the spirit of Amartya Sen, but not the same as him, but in that spirit of saying development should be conceived to have a value of freedom and equality, or in Sen's words, so that we can live a life that we value, irrespective of what we value, but in that way. So just a quick look at, I'm afraid as a lawyer you'll be looking at lots of legal texts. The Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, in the preambular phrase says that the WTO recognises that there is a need for positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and especially the least developed among them, secure a share in growth in international trade commensurate with the needs of their economic development. So from the very outset we can see that the WTO as an economic institution is fundamentally centering its concept of development on economic development, productivity, economic growth. And that shouldn't really surprise us. In 2001, development sort of came back to the fore for the WTO with the Doha Development Agenda, and obviously those of you who are in the know of WTO law know that the Doha Development Agenda is still ongoing. We've just had the Bali round, and it's still in its current impasse. They don't seem to be able to move forward from it just yet. But at the heart of this is development, and there were various ways that they're trying to put development back into the heart of the WTO through reform of agricultural trade, given that most developing countries are monocultural agricultural producers. In terms of the concept of development as one being rooted in productivity, that's the idea that they need to improve the programs that are implemented predominantly by developed countries that affect economic growth in developing countries through the use of agricultural subsidies. To ensure that liberalisation respects the need for sustainable economic growth in developing countries, and to improve their access to global markets. So essentially, finding a way to integrate developing countries into the global economy. In 2005, the spirit of Doha was reaffirmed at the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration, where they say that they're re-emphasising the development dimension in every aspect of Doha work. So this idea that development should really be at the heart of everything that they're thinking about when negotiating trade policy. What I'm particularly interested in my work is how the legal framework and the interpretation of the legal framework through the jurisprudence of the dispute settlement body is reaffirming development as economic development, a very narrow construction that is predominantly influenced by developed country needs and wants rather than the development needs and wants of developing countries. So again, looking at it through Sen's framework, looking at development as a means and an end, so freedom as a means and an end of development, and equality as a means and an end to development is part of what I'm interested in. And later on I'll start to look at the Economic Partnership Agreement to show how or whether equality is actually at the heart of that framework. From a legal perspective, perhaps the most influential theoretical position that we can draw on is that of Weber, a Weberian analysis of law, to say that an increasing rationalization of law will support and sustain a capitalist economy. So law is influenced by economics, but it's not determined by economic activity. But nevertheless, for economic growth to be supported by a legal system, that legal system has to be formal, it must be certain, and it must be stable. So the rules must be clear, and they must be set out in a way that is easy for the members of the WTO to understand. But what's interesting about Weberian analysis is this concept of the iron cage, and this idea that if we continue to rationalise the legal system to a point of hyper-rationalisation and over-bureaucratisation, where we have too much regulation, then effectively our sense of meaning as a society and our concept of freedom is completely gone. So the point here is whether the WTO is shifting towards this increasing rationalisation, what impact that has for our sense of being within the institution, what that means for development, if we're looking at development as a more holistic concept. In terms of putting regionalism in context, I know some of the other speakers have already done this, so I'll go through this very quickly. There are currently 604 regional trade agreements notified to the WTO, including GATT and GATS, so trade in goods and trade in services. 422 are notified under Article 24, which is the legal provision I'll be looking at in a moment. This deals with North-North and North-South regional trade agreements, so those where they are either between developed countries, North-North, or where there is at least one developed country member in the group, North-South. There are 39 regional trade agreements notified under the Enabling Clause, and these are known as South-South regional trade agreements, and we'll also look at that legal framework. Of the 604 in total, there are 398 in force. In terms of free trade agreements, they account for 90% of that, so you can see the effect that the impasse at the multilateral level is having in terms of regional activity beneath it. I've put the enabling clause first because we'll spend the rest of the time talking about Article 24, but usually this comes after Article 24 in the analysis. And this is for South-South regional trade agreements, and you'll see that all it requires is the mutual reduction or elimination of tariffs in accordance with criteria or conditions which may be prescribed by the contracting parties. There's very little there to tell us what that actually means, and in practice with only 39 in force, there aren't that many regions coming together under this provision. And that's another interesting question altogether, is why they don't choose the enabling clause rather than Article 24. Presumably it's because the enabling clause has a process of graduation, whereby once you reach a certain level of economic development, you're therefore no longer able to classify under this system. Instead, what I'm really interested in is the legal interpretation of Article 24. The relevant provision for us is paragraph 8, which sets out the requirements for creating a customs union or a free trade area. In terms of what's important for this discussion, we can just focus on the bit in bold, and it's the idea that you're creating a space, a regional space, where duties and other restrictive regulations of commerce are eliminated with respect to substantially all trade. And there's another aspect to this, which is that it must be done within a reasonable period of time. That's all we know. And so what I'm particularly interested in is how Article 24 is being used in practice and what implications this has for North-South development. So as I said, in terms of liberalisation, you must liberalise substantially all trade. We only have one case from the dispute settlement body, which is the Turkey textiles case, which is actually about something completely different. It was about Article 24 being invoked as a defence rather than an examination of the scope of Article 24. But what the appellate body did say is that what constitutes substantially all trade is just something considerably more than some of the trade. It doesn't give you any percentage, it doesn't give you any sort of quantitative or qualitative aspects. They very helpfully then said it does have qualitative and quantitative components, but again, just left that there. And we know from the understanding that accompanies Article 24 that sectoral exclusion is not permitted, and yet we have the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU, which is an Article 24 notified agreement. So it's highly problematic. And in terms of this particular sort of research area that I'm looking at, what is interesting is the way that substantially all trade has been interpreted by the dominant members in the WTO. So say, for example, the EU pits it at 85 to 90% of trade. Australia says that should be 95% of trade. Presumably, the higher the volume, the higher the level of trade, that would be closer to substantially all than about 70 to 80, but, you know, that's the way it works. And so what I'm looking at is the idea that because it's substantially all trade and because Article 24 requires reciprocity between the parties, i.e. that each side lowers their tariffs to one another, this implies some kind of equality between the groups, that they're on some kind of equal footing and that they're both able to liberalise in accordance with this legal framework. And my question is, when we're looking at RTAs that deal with North and South members, does this really promote equality and freedom between the parties, or is it perpetuating structures of dependency that are pre-existing from former regimes? And just as an aside, they can, under the EC drugs arrangements case, we know that you can differentiate between developing nations according to their development, financial and trade needs, but once again we have no idea what that means. So you have very different practice coming out from different states. In terms of regionalism as a development strategy, we can see that the Singaporean Ministerial Conference recognised the importance of regionalism and its growth within the multilateral context, saying that it can promote further liberalisation and may assist least developed, developing and transition economies in integrating into the international trading system. So we've shifted the discourse from just being the Doha development agenda, where development should be at the heart of trade, to saying actually regionalism is an effective development strategy and we should be promoting development through our regional trade agreements. I won't go over the history of the EPAs because I think you've already had enough of that already, and that saves me time anyway. But the EPAs are described as the EU as drivers of development. Okay, so again, the EU is bringing this term into its legal discourse. And we know that following the EC bananas dispute, which was a very long-running dispute about the banana trade between the EU and African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, trade must be reciprocal. It can no longer be unilateral as it was under Yaoundé and Lomé, but that trade can be asymmetric. And what that essentially means is that you've got these phase-in periods that we've just heard about from Sophie. You can have certain periods of liberalisation. The EPAs are brought within the Cotonou Agreement. This is their legal basis, which came into force in 2000. And at the heart of the Cotonou Agreement is this idea that partnership should be centred on the objective of reducing and eventually eradicating poverty, consistent with the objective of sustainable development and the gradual implementation of ACP countries into the world economy. So you're seeing a different language being used here. It's not economic development. They're introducing concepts of poverty and of sustainable development, which shows a shift in the legal terminology being used that is more reflective of the shifts that we've seen in development studies over recent times. But you can see that the EU is describing them as drivers of development, which will strengthen the rule of law in the economic field. And there is a growing interest amongst us lawyers of the relationship between law and economics and how one and the other can be mutually reinforcing. In terms of the EPAs, this is the current situation. There's only one ratified, but that only has 7 out of 15 CARIFORUM countries in the Caribbean, and only 16 of the 28 EU members, so it's still not implemented properly. Southern African Development Community initialed it in July 2014. But there's another aspect to this that's important that hasn't yet been discussed, and that's this idea of hegemonic RTAs, where you have north-south regional partners coming together, and one of them assumes a hegemonic role within that group. And we've heard already that South Africa seems to do that within SACU and SADC. But the question here is whether the EU is doing it within the EPA framework. And for all those who might be critical and say, the EU is just doing what it needs to do or whatever, the EU passed a regulation, 1528/2007, and this was when the original waiver was coming to an end in 2008. They applied for a new waiver at the WTO level, and it was granted. And with effect from the 1st of October 2014, no duty-free, quota-free access was going to be available to any EPA country that had failed to sign the EPA. And this is showing how actually within these regional trade agreements, pushing for substantially all trade is actually quite a coercive act within this legal framework. And the EU is not alone, there are lots of other countries that do it and other regions that do it, but is using the law as a tool to shape the development process in other countries. And as an example of that coercive nature of the relationship, the EU is currently refusing to refund Kenya for import duties until the agreement is ratified. So Kenya is no longer accessing the EU market on the favourable terms it was before. It's now paying tariffs between, I think it was 4 to 20%, depending on its products, it will pay those import duties and the export duties, and the EU will not refund them until the agreement is ratified. And there's just a quote there from the Nigerian Trade Minister, Olusegun. "We must not sign an agreement without first of all carrying out a robust economic analysis of the overall impact the agreement will have on the region, our children and future generations." And in terms of, I'll wrap up now, but in terms of why I think development should be given a much more holistic concept and actually built into the legal framework, there is space to do it within the legal framework. We can see that already Article 24 is defined in completely suboptimal terms. So there is space to create a more development-friendly approach to regional trade. And I think it's interesting to think about why that has not happened when there is space for it to happen. And another, just to link with the presentation we had earlier, another important part of this, in terms of a development strategy for regionalism, is the contentious issues that were raised, particularly by Namibia, about the SADC EPA, was the MFN clause, the most favoured nation clause. And what this meant was that any country that EPA negotiating group went to sign on another trade agreement with would have to offer exactly the same terms to the EU. Which means that in terms of China's influence, in terms of Brazil and India, which Southern Africa is very interested in trading with, they would not be able to get more favourable terms than the EU. And just to put it into context, Namibia exports 4% of its export products to other African nations and 96% to the EU. So these are very structurally dependent countries. And that's why I think it's time to sort of reimagine our concept of development within the legal framework, in the hope that we can actually progress beyond this illusionary concept that we have so far. So I'll end there.
Thanks very much.